How did that land for you? You feel like the table's been set? Feel like you're ready to have this conversation? So, the first candidate who we're going to be speaking with today is also the first person who agreed when we said, will you come and speak with people who have been system impacted? Will you come and speak with people who have been incarcerated? Will you come inside the site of a former prison and do that? We're going to hear in just a few moments from the junior senator from the state of California and the 2020 Democratic presidential candidate, Senator Kamala Harris, is with us today. She will be joined in conversation by Reverend Vivian Nixon, who has dedicated her life to ensuring that when women come home from prison, they have access to public higher education. And I'll say that has particular resonance with me. My parents were administrators at the City University of New York. I grew up in a family that believed in public higher education. And I knew when they started taking dollar for dollar in New York State, under a Democratic governor, the exact amount of money and putting it into the single largest prison expansion New York had ever known under Mario Cuomo, that there was a correlation between education and incarceration. They will be joined on stage by one of the most popular and brilliant Emmy Award-winning journalists in the field working today, Ari Melber of The Beat. And so we are very, very honored to bring them aboard and up on stage today. But as we do, I was thinking about everybody in California, talking to some friends of mine last night and unbelievably very early this morning. And as I think about the way that the wildfires and the smokes are disrupting people's lives, I also want to bring into the space all of the prisoners who are fighting. I want to remember the prisoners who lost their lives trying to save other people's lives. That's a myth I'd like to disrupt. But with that said, I'm going to make my way off of this stage and ask, please, Ari Melber and Reverend Vivian Nixon and Senator Kamala Harris to please join us on stage today. Or not, or I could keep talking to you and come back over here. There's always that surprise. Who knew? I'm trying to get a signal. Jimmy, who is working so diligently in the back, he's saying keep talking. They're walking up. Here we go. So a little awkward moment, but I don't care. This is the story of my life. It's the story if you've been system impacted, but we see them coming today. And so I'll try that again. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Ari Melber, Reverend Vivian Nixon, and Senator Kamala Harris.
Good day, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the warm welcome for Senator Harris and Vivian Nixon. I'm going to kick us off, and then Vivian's going to ask the first question, and we'll get right into it. Senator, thank you for being here.
It's great to be with you, with all these leaders. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We've been following the same program that you've been watching backstage, and the theme that comes through, obviously, is mass incarceration has been a method where we have seen people disappeared, not only pulled out of their communities, but even after serving their time and doing their work, they return to the communities and are told they don't have a civic voice. They can't vote, as the Reverend was discussing. They can't participate. They are disappeared. And so I think it is obviously quite important that we're not only talking about that today and reflecting on that and learning from experts and the directly impacted, but clearly we're doing something about it, because this is now a discussion that will be led by people who are directly impacted. So that's the spirit. That's all I wanted to say to kick it off. I'm going to turn it over to Vivian to ask the first question. we've got a microphone on the chair, too.
Oh, I must have missed it. I didn't see it. Thank you. Thank you, Ari. And thank you, Senator Kamala Harris, for joining us, and to every single person in the audience for taking time out of your schedules to be here. It's a small and tight but extremely powerful room. I can look out and see the work that all of you have done to get us to where we are today, so thank you. Senator Harris, today's town hall is the first time a conversation between presidential candidates and impacted people on criminal justice reform has taken place during this election season. You were the first candidate to commit to coming to our town hall today.
That's right.
Why are you here today, and why have you chosen to prioritize this in your campaign to be the next president of the United States?
Thank you, Reverend. One, it is about my life's work, and it is also about what I know that if we are going to be a nation that is true to our stated values, which includes a stated value to care about humanity, the values that include issues like the age-old concept of redemption. If we are to be true to those values, then we know that the criminal justice system of America and the incarceration system in America has not been humane and has not lived up to those values and must be reformed. Redemption, an age-old concept, right? In the Christian faith, but in many religions, which says, because it knows everyone will make a mistake. For some, that will rise to the level of being a crime. But is it not the sign of a civil society that you allow people their way to earn their way back and give them the support? So yes, there will be accountability, but there also must be a path. And I have visited many prisons. I know what has been going on in the system, which is why way back when I made a very conscious decision to become a prosecutor, knowing how broken and how unjust the criminal justice system of America can be. And so when I was in a position where I didn't have to ask anybody permission, when I was the elected DA of San Francisco, I created one of the first in the nation reentry initiatives, focused on what we must do, understanding that we have to allow people a way to come back to the community and give a path that includes focusing on education, focusing on job skills development, focusing on housing, focusing on the fact that so many are parents who have a natural desire to parent their children, even if not the resources or the skills. And so knowing that you were hosting this forum, I am now running for president, I just wanted to come and be a part of this conversation and lend whatever I could to this important gathering of leaders. So thank you.
Thank you. So just to follow up on that a little bit, I'm going to read you a quote that you may recognize.
Okay.
America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice. I know this history well, of innocent men framed, of charges brought against people without sufficient evidence, of prosecutors hiding information that would exonerate defendants, of the disproportionate application of the law. Do you recognize that quote?
Yes, I do.
This is from your recent memoir.
Yes, those are my words.
And I want you to reflect kind of on the theme of redemption that you just brought up,
Yeah.
and the fact that there are progressives who are looking at some of your prosecutorial record and identifying moments that didn't seem so progressive to them. And wondering, how do you reconcile that with the decisions you have to make as a prosecutor?
Yeah.
And what has changed since that time? What have you learned through the process of having to make hard decisions that didn't please everybody?
Well, there's so much, thankfully, that has changed since that time. Remember, when I decided to become a prosecutor, because frankly, one should know themselves. I knew I wasn't so good asking permission. And I knew I wanted to be in a role where I could implement change in the criminal justice system. And so I decided to, go up the rough side of the mountain and go inside. where I could make decisions. And so when I made a decision to create Back on Track, it was one of the first in the nation. And as you know, folks, when I was elected to DA back in 2003, which are the dark ages compared to where we are now in terms of what the country understands we need by way of reform. And so when I created that initiative, people would say to me, why are you giving them jobs? Other people who have not committed any offense need jobs. People would say to me, you're supposed to be a prosecutor, which means you're supposed to be locking people up, not letting them out. And so, but it took a force of will, and I took some hard knocks for it, to say, no, we need to do better. And because I literally pulled out a yellow pad and wrote down and created the program. I said, I know, for example, 18 through 24-year-olds, so many have now been felons for life and branded felons for life because they took a path that appeared to them to be their only path of economic opportunity, which was to sell drugs. And now they are felons for life. I looked at the fact that there were so many who were being arrested. And I said, I'm going to create a program around that population, knowing that 18 through 24, if they were in another circumstance, such as in college, Ari, they'd be called college kids. But when they're in the system and you turn 18, you're considered an adult, period. Even though we know when they're 18 through 24 in college, what do? We put them in dormitories with a resident assistant because we know, and sometimes a curfew, because we know they may not make good decisions sometimes. But for that same population when they're on the street, their entire life can be faced with the burdens of lengthy incarceration, of being prohibited from voting, from being banned from having access to federal resources, including everything from student loans to SNAP to getting able to get a job or qualify for the certificate that is necessary to take on the job that will allow you dignity and a way to support your family. So I created this program, and it included bringing in folks like the building trades, right? The ones who had the apprenticeships, the carpenters were amazing. It included bringing in lawyers to teach these young people, men and women, their rights around. I used to teach street law, so we were teaching them about landlord-tenant and laws like that, so they would have the power that they needed. And we ended up reducing their recidivism by such huge proportions that it became a national model. The Holder Department of Justice designated my program as a model of innovation for law enforcement in the United States. And I knew this work was possible. I knew the work was possible that we did later when I became Attorney General. I wanted to take it statewide. So in the California Department of Justice, which I ran, which is the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, we started a recidivism reduction and reentry division of the State Department of Justice, creating incentives for counties around a state of 40 million people to do exactly what we knew could be done to help reenter folks. And we also created, because again, I didn't have to ask anybody permission. I was running the agency. So we also created a data collection system. Tell me about deaths in custody. Tell me how many deaths in custody, where. Answer the questions of how those deaths in custody are occurring. Because otherwise the families often can't get answers, but the system is not holding itself accountable.
So, Senator, I want to jump in only because, and I'll do it to everyone, I want to get audience questions. So I have one follow-up to Vivian's, and then we're going to go to an audience question. Yes. The follow-up is, when you talk about this record, part of your argument has been what you were just saying, which is you were doing a lot of things that were for reform. Yeah. And you've also talked about changing some positions. For example, you've publicly said you back now independent probes when there's police-involved shootings.
Yeah, we can talk about
and there was a shift on that. Mm-hmm. I wonder if, given where we are in the audience we have here, has there been a time where you have seen something that came out of your office, in the prosecutorial's office or the AG, and you look back on it and you say, we went too far, or you've said to any impacted family, that sentence was too long? Yeah. Is there a place to say not only everything we did for the right reason at the time, but looking at it now, we went too far? Is that part of your view?
Absolutely. That's why I have been pushing for years for what we need in terms of sentencing reform. You will see from my criminal justice policy when I become president, it includes also doing what we need to do to give federal resources to local counties to process expungements, because there's a real backlog where they occur. It's about taking clemency reviews out of the Department of Justice, because that's the very place where the sentences occurred, and so that there will be an independent analysis of it. It is about legalizing marijuana. It is about taking the profit out of prisons. And so on day one, I will shut down federal funding of for-profit prisons. But here's the other thing, Ari, that I do want to say on this subject. I am the only person on that debate stage who has dedicated their life to reforming this criminal justice system. I've been working on that since the early 2000s. There are a lot of people who have language now about it, but I would ask you to challenge them, ask them, what have they actually done to reform the criminal justice system? And then I will have more of a conversation with you about my record.
So the senator has questions for me, too. We wanted to get that answer, and I want to turn, as promised, to Ivelisse Galestra.
Hi, everybody. First of all, this is great to be here with great minds, survivors. Okay. So my name is Ivelisse Galestra, and I am the community organizer for College and Community Fellowship.
Right.
My question is to you, Senator Harris. Last year, Congress passed the largest criminal justice reform measure in recent history, the First Step Act, which is problematic in itself. You supported the bill, but called it a compromise of a compromise. Yeah. And many criticisms of the legislation and other reform efforts stem from the focus point that it basically geared towards nonviolent and low-level transgressions. Mm-hmm. So if any real progress is to be made to end this narrative, where do we leave serious or even violent transgressions, right? Yeah. So my question is, what is your vision of how we can shift this dominant narrative and social construct and analyze the root of violence in the United States of America and really,
that's right,
really include people with violent transgressions as me, a Latina with a violent transgression in the conversations,
that's right,
and in the criminal legal efforts,
that's right,
that we are discussing now.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you're right. You're right. I was very critical of the First Step Act, and I actually was unwilling for quite some time to sign on to it. We were able to negotiate as a result of that some improvements, but it's a fine first step. But we need that's like saying you just took a first step, but you need to learn how to walk. We actually need like the plan for step 10. And so it relates to a number of things. It's about what we need to do around so-called serious and violent offenses and what we do around reduction, for example, of sentencing. So you'll see in my plan of action when I become president, includes re-examining sentences that are 20 years long or longer and re-evaluating them to determine if there should be a release or a shortening of that sentence. Because I am all too well aware of the fact that you can talk about reform of the system starting today and moving forward, but there are still hundreds and thousands of people who have been incarcerated and are currently incarcerated under the former system, and so we need retroactive application, which the First Step Act did not do adequately. Right. Let's talk about incarcerated women. So during my career, a large part of my career as a prosecutor was focused on crimes against girls, children, and women. I specialized for a long time in child sexual assault cases. I specialized for a long time in rape cases, human trafficking cases. And I am very aware that up to probably more like 90% of the women who are incarcerated have in their lifetime been abused on one level or another. I am all too aware that the women who are incarcerated, that the incarceration of women in America has increased 8-fold since 1980. I am all too well aware that we have a system of incarceration in this country. We talk about child separation policies, of which I'm fighting against as it relates to our immigrant brothers and sisters. America's criminal justice system has child separation policies. Let's talk truth. Let's talk truth. And this relates to both men and women. Because here's the other thing I know. Young men, older men, they want to father their children. They may not be in paid child support, but they love their children and want to be engaged with their children. And as it relates specifically to women, we place them often hundreds of miles away from their children. As a population of incarcerated women are sentenced to shorter periods of time, which means they're coming out. They want to and need to bond with their children while they're in. And we're charging inmates, regardless of gender, at least $1 a minute to have a phone conversation with their families. Charging people up to $22 for a bar of soap when they're incarcerated. And no plans for recognizing that, okay, this person may have offended on one way or another, but they are still a parent. And there is still a family. And so I look at the incarcerated women population about all of the collateral consequences of incarcerating women. So you will see in my plan of action, there is heavy emphasis on decarceration of women. Also what we need to do to allow for overnight visits with their children. And also doing an assessment and requiring reporting about how far in miles and distance we place women from their children and from men, the same point. Because these are all issues that we are not discussing that are very real. When we talk about reentry, we have to look at the effect on the children of incarcerated parents and understand all that we are doing to create trauma for those children because of the incarceration of their parents and how we need to address that to avoid that trauma. Not to mention the fact that one of America's biggest public policy failures has been mental health. And so what has ended up happening is we're using jails and prisons as the antidote for the failure to address mental health in America.
Well, that being said, and relating it back to the First Step Act.
Yes.
Which relies heavily on risk assessment tools.
Yeah.
That are biased.
They're awful.
And so if you are going to be evaluated by a biased tool, and you have a history of mental illness, or if you happen to be incarcerated at an early age for your first time, all of that counts against you.
That's right.
As it pertains to getting access to the programs that make you eligible for early release.
That's right.
That is disparately going to impact poor people and people of color and people who have mental health problems. How would you change that element of First Step?
Right.
And also, how would you change the influx of money that is going to come from the federal government to private industries to make electronic monitoring the next wave of incarceration?
Yeah, no, you're right. And so let me just say that back to the earlier question, that was one of the reasons that I opposed the First Step Act, because they had the risk assessment being created by the Attorney General, who at the time was Jeff Sessions. You hear me? So we got it shifted so that it would be with consultation of the experts before any risk assessment system would actually be approved. We've got to take money out of the criminal justice system and profit. So I mentioned earlier what it is around what we need to do and can do and will do around shutting down the for-profit prisons. But there are whole industries that are associated with the incarceration people, including those monitoring, the electronic monitoring, where the business model is still to shackle somebody and make money from it. Let's talk about the video conferencing system in prisons. Extremely expensive. People are profiting off of the desire a human being has to stay in touch with their family. The telephone system, the commissary. People are supposed to be allowed at least one bar of soap a month. They're paying $22. There have been studies that have done for a bar of soap. So there has to be, and this is part of what my intention is in terms of what action we're going to take, is to do a whole, basically, audit of America's federal prison system to figure out who is making the money, who is charging what, where that money is going, and to whom. Because be clear about it to the point, Reverend. There are a lot of people making money off of this prison system and the system of incarceration. So when we talk about the pulls and the pushes in the system, part of it is profit, people making money.
I want to go out to another audience question and pick up on something that's obviously been in the national conversation a lot when you think about the tensions around the president and whether, as we sit in a former penitentiary, whether he is in fact often acting in lawless ways without accountability. We talk a lot about checks and balances in America, and yet there are so few actual checks on the treatment of individuals once they're incarcerated. But if America is going to have checks and balances, then that has to be provided for. And I think that's part of the thrust of the next question. I want to turn to Dennis Gaddy. Dennis, thank you for your question. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Senator Harris, for being here for this historic event. Dennis Gaddy is my name. I bring you greetings from the state of North Carolina, where we're part of the Voters Organized to Educate Family, as well as the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance. And a big shout out to the group that I lead, Community Success Initiatives, who's having a watch party in Raleigh today.
Oh, wonderful.
Right. I cut my teeth 15 years ago trying to be a part of this work about reentry, and I followed you. I watched you as being part of that time when there wasn't even a word called reentry back in those days, and I was able to learn from you and Jeremy Travis and John Jay and those kinds of folks. So the question I have for you today is this. In prisons across the country, people who are incarcerated are living in inhumane, abusive, and unsafe conditions. There's currently a law on the books called the Prison Litigation Reform Act, or PLRA, which severely cripples the ability of incarcerated people to challenge the conditions of confinement. Elected leaders should not have to be sued to change these conditions. If elected president, you're going to be in charge of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is one of the largest prison systems in the country. What policies will you put in place to make sure that conditions of confinement are humane and rehabilitative? And do you support repealing the PLRA?
Yes to the last part, if it in any way prevents people from suing or having their day in court and having their moment of justice. But as I said earlier, one of the first steps that that's now been, one of the first points of action that I will take is an audit. We need to conduct an audit across the board to make transparent and clear what too many people who have been incarcerated and their families know too well. And that's part of what I did in California when I was running the Department of Justice there, is to make public all this stuff that had been held secret. And then so the activists and the leaders from the outside would have to scrape and scratch to get the data out, to get the facts out. So one, do that to make it transparent, but also to take the profit system out of the prison system. And then also things like what I've been doing even in the Senate around, for example, conditions for incarcerated women, where we still have in states a practice and policies where women can even be shackled during childbirth, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to do. But we need to take action right away. Legislation is fine. I'm all for it. But this is part of one of the reasons I'm running for president, is to reform America's criminal justice system. It is, to your point, part of my life's work. And I know what we can do to actually do better. And look, nobody can question when I say that we need to reform the system. I have safety and everybody's safety in mind. I know that we will have healthier and therefore safer communities when we reform the criminal justice system of America. Because let's be clear about this. Part of what I think the problem on public policy with criminal justice, part of the problem has been that people think the goal is safe communities. So if you think the goal is safe communities, then you immediately go to systems of incarceration, systems of law enforcement. Instead of understanding the goal should be healthy communities, because healthy communities are safe communities. And healthy communities are achieved by putting resources into mental health, into affordable housing, into job training, into public education, into family support systems. That's how you create healthy communities, which will always be safe communities.
I'm just jumping in because we have 4 minutes. As you know, you have a very busy schedule.
Yes.
I know Vivian wanted to touch on education.
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, let me touch on one more thing about the conditions. Will you work to ban solitary confinement?
Oh, it's already in my plan.
Okay, good.
I'm banning solitary. No, it's there. I will not just work. I will ban solitary confinement of both adults and juveniles.
Thank you.
It is inhumane.
It is.
And unnecessary. Yes.
Thank you. I've spent the better part of all of the 20 years I've been out of prison to empower women with criminal justice histories to earn college degrees. Our goal in my organization is to support these women so that they can thrive, so their families can thrive, and so their communities can thrive. This system is woefully inadequate in preparing incarcerated individuals to reenter society in any meaningful way other than subsistence living.
Yeah.
You did excellent work in California in making sure that higher education was available in every prison. What other things will you do as president to ensure that people can get above that razor wire ceiling that most of our reentry efforts limit them to?
Yeah, and there's a lot to be done, but I will also connect it with what we need to do immediately when folks are released, because we've got to not only ban the box, we've got to end the federal bans on federal support going to folks for everything from SNAP to college loans and student loans to housing. All of these bans make the education we can offer meaningless if when people come out they don't have access to the resources that help everybody else actually go on to those paths for employment and higher education. So within the incarcerated population, it's not only the work that I've done in the past, as you said, around education and the partnership that needs to go into that, but also it truly, I cannot underemphasize enough the need for real resources going into mental health and treatment. I look at issues like childhood trauma. The number of children that we have growing up with trauma, because let's be clear, poverty is trauma-inducing. Being exposed to violence is trauma-inducing. And when we don't have those interventions, they normally lead to what we end up seeing in the incarcerated population, and we have not ever had any real intervention. And so if we're going to help people get on their feet when they get out, that has to be a big part of it. In addition, it has to be about getting people on the pathway towards the jobs that need to be filled. And so that means having education that is about getting that certificate and not just wood shop. I'm so sick of these programs that I'm just sick of it, honestly. I'm sorry. But, I mean, literally, if you go, it's about the quality. It's not just saying there's going to be training, because we all know that training that usually happens in jails and prisons is nothing compared to the jobs that need to be filled and that pay enough for people to have a quality of life. Like literally, Ari, wood shop is being taught, where people are using the saw to make a key. I mean, like a big key, a decorative wooden key. That ain't getting nobody a job. And right, we know what I'm talking about. So it has to be about meaning. And then again, that's about doing an assessment of what is actually happening in terms of the quality of the training, not just training, check the box, but the quality of the training.
And I'm told that we're a minute out, and so I want to end with we've talked so much policy, which I think is a testament to the seriousness and the expertise in this room. All of you, Vivian, and of course we're dealing with an expert. I want to end on people, not policy. Okay. You're here talking to people. I'm just going to be direct. I'm a reporter, so I just say what I think is true. You're talking to people who, as we discussed, have been told through the rules and through the treatment, oftentimes their voice doesn't matter. And even after they pay their debt to society, their voice doesn't matter, or they don't get a voice anymore. And on the panel before you came out here, of course, on issues, people were speaking about the different state levels to reform that. I think in closing, with whatever else you want to say in closing, because we want to give you a final thought, could you tell us in the world, because the world's watching, obviously, beyond this room, why was it important to you to come have dialogue with people who have served time, with family members who've been through this? Why is it important that these voices are part of how we pick the next president?
Well, these are the leaders. This is a room of leaders who understand what is actually happening in the system, and who know that if we're going to be true to our values, and if we want healthy communities, if we want to be true to the values of redemption, we have to agree that the incarceration system of America is one of the greatest failures of public policy in our country. It is truly. It has been, the emphasis has been on punishment. The emphasis has been on pushing people out. instead of allowing people a way back in. And it has not been thoughtful. It has been punitive. It has been a result of wars that have been waged on Americans. Like, be clear about that, too. So much of what has led to America's mass incarceration has been based on domestic wars. The war on drugs. That was a war on our own people. That's how that actually played out. And so these are prisons that are like federal detention centers, like as though these are people who are threatening our nation's security. I mean, if you want to talk about a threat to nation's security, talk about Donald Trump. I know. And so, if you want to talk about lawlessness, so anyway, the bottom line is this. We need to reform the system. I wanted to be here to be able to listen, to be able to share my piece of this process that has been a process of people shedding a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to try and have America understand that it is a broken, failed system and must be reformed. And I'm honored to be among the leaders who are here, and I thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Senator.
Join me in thanking Senator Harris. We will be back with more. Senator, thank you. Vivian, thank you.
All of you, please join me in giving a rousing thank you to Reverend Vivian Nixon, Senator Kamala Harris, and the always incomparable Ari Melber. For our friends in the press, let me note that if you can hold for 2 minutes, the senator has generously agreed to make her time available, but please hold.